Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story is part 2 in the story entitled The Hunters Guild Entry, The Roman Werewolf. Six years later. Hey, Marco, are you in here? I'm up here, Remus. Give me a hand with this. Remus was standing outside the open doors of a tall wooden hay barn that stood behind two old pine trees. Give me a hand with this hay. Uncle wants the horse fed before evening meal. A young girl no more than 14 with long blonde hair came running over to the barn entrance. Remus! Remus! Shouted the little girl as her running changed to a brisk skip. Yes, replied Remus. What is it, Cecilia? The blonde-haired girl finally slowed to a stop as she reached the large reed doors. Nothing. I'm just out picking herbs to dry. Father said it's going to be the coldest autumn in 6 years. He said snow might even cover the hills. Mum said that it will be so cold that all the flowers and herbs will die from the frost. Where's Marco? Can you help me hang them in here? Marco looked down. I'm up here, Cecilia. Wait, I'll jump down. Marco stepped towards the edge of the upper level, and just as he was preparing to make his leap down, wham! Marco slipped backwards. A clump of hay sprayed into the air in front of him. Marco's head connected with a harsh thud against the wooden floorboards, and everything went dark. In the darkness, the faint voice of the girl called out, Marco! Marco! The voice became deeper as it grew with clarity. Marco! Marco! Wake up! Lucius was kneeling down next to the young boy, gently shaking him. We need to get you back on road. We should be nearing your uncle's property by sundown. Marco rose from his makeshift bed, still sleepy-eyed due to the uncomfortable roadside night. Here, eat this. Atticus, who was going through his travel bag, extended his hand to Marco and presented the boy with a half a bread roll. Marco was glad to see the dark brown doughy loaf, as the better nights on the road had left him with an extraordinary appetite. How far do we have left? Muttered Marco as he stuffed the last mouthful of bread into his mouth. It's over the next pass, as Lucius said. We should reach there by sunset. The three were up and ready and being once more on the trail when a piercing howl rang throughout the pine forest. Marco's face went pale white as he fell over backwards, scrambling to get away. Atticus reached down and pulled the boy to his feet. It's coming, it's back, it's found me! Lucius began to laugh at the frightened child and his erratic movements. Ha 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 ha. That was just a jackal. They're common up here. Nothing to be afraid of. Atticus scowled at his younger brother, who, in return, stopped his chuckling almost instantaneously. Lucius, get the horses saddled. We're moving on. Lucius huffed and began to saddle his horse. He heaved and laid in the saddle over his mare. As he did, a large object wrapped in cloth came flying out from one of the satchels and hit the dirt with a puff of dust. The dagger was almost a foot long with a plain leather-wrapped handle, revealed as the cloth wrapped around the weapon had suddenly loosened. Marco looked at it with amazement. He immediately picked it up and held it in the light. The metal looked too pristine to be any iron tool as he had held it higher. It shined with a dazzling brightness in the sunrise. Wow! What's this made from? It's like a mirror. Silver, replied Atticus. Marco stared at him with confusion and then back at the shining dagger. The girl's voice returned, this time a little less faint and more demanding. Marco! Marco! Wake up! Marco! Wake up! Images of the werewolf came flashing back into his mind. Marco! In his mind, the sound of his mother screaming, Please, Marco! The gurgling of blood as the wolf slashed his brother's neck came ringing into his ears. Marco woke up in his room. The sunlight was cutting through the top of his window shutters. His head was in a bandage and throbbing painfully as it lay on the pillow that was damp with his sweat. He slowly rose to a sitting position and looked over to the slim blonde girl with wavy hair, who was clasping his hand. "Cecilia! Oh, by God, my head! What happened?" Cecilia began to break down into a splattering sob. "He fell off the hay barn." Tears were rolling down her cheeks. Her eyes were red, a sign that these were not her first that she had shed that evening. "I did what?" mumbled Marco, a confused look over his face, and she began to sob harder. "Hey, don't be like that, Sally. I'm okay." "No, Marco." She slowly wiped her running nose with her sleeve. "That was 2 days ago." With that, Cecilia fell onto him with a powerful embrace that caused her long blonde hair to smother Marco, who again fell onto his back. "You were talking in your sleep." She squeezed him even tighter. "Ouch! Careful, Sally. What was I saying?" She lifted off of his chest and pushed her gold locks back over her shoulder. "Well," she murmured before staring him straight in the eye. "You sounded terrified, like something was after you." Marco's face was grimaced with terror. He looked at his cousin's arm to see red handprints covered her wrist. He struggled as a feeling of guilt clogged his dry throat. "Did I do that to you?" he asked. "It's okay, I'm fine." The next evening, once Marco knew he would be alone, he slid under his bed and found a loose floorboard. Carefully lifting the board as not to make a sound, he reached under and pulled out a long object that was wrapped in a tattered cloth. He crawled out to the middle of his room and began to unwrap it, pausing to make sure he was truly alone. As the dust-covered cloth fell away, it revealed the leather-wrapped handle of a silver dagger. Marco was amazed at the discovery. He had completely forgot only moments before. He had been in total panic over Jackal. Lucius stopped packing them out and walked over to the boy. "This is not like a regular knife, Marco." "It's not thin and not particularly sharp," remarked Atticus as he rolled his blanket and tied it to his mount's saddle. Marco acknowledged him and continued looking at the dagger, then turned so that the sun would stop blinding him. The dagger was, as Attic said, it was tapered to a point, but instead of two sharp edges, it was thicker with a centre ridge that ran all the way to the point and was indeed rounded at the edges. "Silver," proclaimed Atticus. "It's not as strong as iron. It can hold a good cutting edge, so a thrusting weapon is more effective. This shape stops the dagger from bending." "Well," replied Marco, "what is it for?" "It's for you, Marco," replied Lucius. "It's a parting gift from our father, but you must not let your uncle know about this. Some questions are better left unanswered." "What do I tell them about father and mother and—" "Listen, Marcus." Atticus knelt down next to the softly sobbing boy. "We planned to tell you this before we handed you to your uncle. The reason we don't have any weapons is because the creature that attacked your family does not come up this far north. Do you see those flowers, Marco? Do you know what violet heads are? Those are the Aconitum napalus. Most people call it monk's hood. We don't know why. But the wolf is never seen when these flowers are present. During the autumn months, that's when the monk's hood blooms." Marco looked at him. His eyes were swelling as tears cascaded down his cheeks. "Why are you calling it a wolf? It's not a wolf. I've seen wolves. A wolf will attack and kill sheep or two. It can't rip a door clean off a house. It wasn't a wolf." "I'm sorry you saw that, Marco. That wolf, that thing, it stays in the southern forest because the soil is not rich enough to support the wild flowers. That's why we're taking you here. It can't get to you while the monkshood blooms." Marco's tears turned to confusion. Why would a monster like that be scared of flowers? "Come on, boy." Lucius mounted his mare and was reaching out a hand to the young boy. "We're only half a day's ride from your uncle. I can't wait for a hot supper." "But wait," he cried. "Why give me a weapon if I'm safe in the north?" They fell silent for a while, a silence that was broken by Lucius. "It's a precaution. Sometimes the winter's frost comes too early, and the frost covers the flowers, and they die before the autumn is over. Never forget, Marco. Beware if the frost should ever come while the trees are brown. The three set off up the mountainside pass. Marco gazed upon rows and rows of fir, spruce and pine trees that made up the hillside forest. The wildflowers sparkled from a dusting of frost that reflected in the morning sun. As they crested the mountain slopes, they came to a vantage point. In the distant lower ground they saw a property, or more like two properties, a flat meadow clearing. Atticus mentioned that it must be 20 acres or more, with the occasional old pine or fir tree dotted among the open fields, but eventually it fell back to what was simply flat land forest. The entire scenery was separated only by a not incredibly deep, but nonetheless wide, stone-bedded river that ran beside the mill house and then as far as could be seen before disappearing into the trees. Marco could see that it wasn't just his uncle and aunt that lived here. Your uncle has 2 children, around your age, but I'm sure that he will be overjoyed to have you, young Marco, said Atticus, ruffling the boy's hair. The miller and his wife live in the mill house. It's only an acre or so away, from what I know. They all help each other out, but a young man with muscles like yours would be a fine addition. The first house, which was quite moderately sized for a family, sat at the front with several rows of stables that led to the main paddocks and grazing. Finally, towards the far side, almost 50 yards from the house, was a large red barn. There was a long dirt path that ran from the back of the property, veering off to the row of stables, and then to the red barn. The mill house was small, but not too small as to be inappropriate for a family. It sat further back along the stream. Atticus had been a little off with his prediction, as the distance was more like several acres. Running pine trees, dead shriveled flowers covered in a blanket of snow, footprints, and then, finally, the fresh open sky. A vantage point. A view from above, looking down over the darkness and the flickering lights of the homestead. A feeling of deep desire, hatred, and insatiable hunger filled Marco as he descended down the mountain path. The bright autumn moon sat high, its spherical visage like an eye, watching all that moves beneath it. Frosted grass crackled under Marco's feet. He was following an undeniably sweet smell that hung in the air. He crept forward and hid beside an old moss-covered fir. His legs, powered by excitement, were tense. His mouth was dripping with anticipation. He sniffed the air. His huge lungs expanded with cold, crisp breeze, and again, then turning his gaze upon the opening of the red barn doors. Skipping out from the doorway was a young teenage girl. Her golden blonde hair glided over her soft shoulders. She was leaving the barn in nothing but a nightdress. Marco's lips trembled as his hand scratched the tree limb he sat under. Desire beat him as he sprang into action. His powerful hind legs made quick work of the distance between them, and with a final push, they launched him at the young girl. His claws impaled her as she slammed into the dirt path. Her soft throat gave little resistance as he tore her open with a hit, with a euphoria of hot steaming blood filling his mouth. He grunted with satisfaction as the last of her wiggling ceased. He lifted up her body from her neck, still in his jaws. She was still. No doubt the impact would have crushed her chest cavity. He leaned forward and urinated on the blood-soaked path. He then carried her crumpled body into the frosty darkness of the night. He awoke. He was drenched in sweat, his covers sticking to him, despite the bitter cold wind that had cut through every crack and every crevice in his wall. Marco was in a fury of rage and fear. Why was he having these dreams, and why now, after so long of nothing? His life felt almost normal, but now he was terrified once again. I'm a grown man, 16 years old, he thought to himself as he sat up. Why is this happening? Why did it feel so real? He snapped over to see Remus had awoken up from commotion. He looked at Sally, but her bed was empty. Remus! Where is she? What? Where's who? Cecilia! Where's Cecilia? Marco, is this some stupid game? I'm really not interested, cousin. This is no game. She's in danger, you fool! Remus stared at his cousin. His tired expression quickly changed to one of fear and confusion. She said she was going to get you some herbs. You were having another nightmare. The worst one we've seen. She was worried, so she left to go get some dried herbs from the barn. What's wrong? Marco froze. He scrambled under his bed and popped the loose floorboards and snatched the silver dagger. Launching to his feet, he darted from the room and flew down to the stairs, to the back door of the house. The catch was open, and the door was ajar. Oh no. Remus, the gladius in the dining room, take it and get to the barn. Marco, what's going on? Marco turned and grabbed Remus by the collar of his shirt. His arms were trembling, but his grip was so powerful that any doubt Remus had that Marco was messing around was extinguished. Just do it! The two boys split up. Marco jumped out the open door and Remus scrambled for the gladius above the fireplace. The icy cold cut through Marco's clothes, and the bitter sting of the frozen ground was enough to be unpleasant, even through his leather boots. Wind was carrying snow, and it was becoming hard for him to see. Marco clasped the dagger tight. He was almost halfway to the barn doors, and the snow had ceased, to the wind still howled. Marco's vision cleared. In front of him were small footprints. No doubt in his mind they belonged to Cecilia, and they had led straight to the barn doors. But as his vision sharpened, he could see to the left of him, just of the path, lay a set of large bipedal tracks. It was here, and it was stalking Cecilia. He knew what he had seen wasn't just a dream. It was a warning, an alarm call in his mind, telling him that the beast was coming. His brain was jumbled with questions, struggling to grasp what was real and if this was just another dream. Why? He thought. Why again? Why now? How? How the fuck did it find me? Is there more than one? But there couldn't be. They can't pass through these woods. And then it hit him. It hit him like he'd been kicked in the chest by a stallion. The answer to why this was all happening. His expression went dead. His heart was frozen within his chest. His legs felt lifeless. It's the frost. Sally said that the frost would kill off all the herbs and the wildflowers. That means the monkshood would be dead. The only reason it couldn't cross these woods was dead. That thing, that werewolf, it made its way through that mountain forest and came for me. At the moment, something flipped in Marcus' mind. It might have come for me, but it doesn't know. I have this. He looked at his silver dagger. Its shining blade had snowflakes running down it, but he knew now that if it had come for him, he was going to give it all before he saw it kill his family. No, again, he said to himself, gritting his teeth. Not this time, you cunt. His heart raised in his chest, filling his body with adrenaline. Before a second thought, he began to run towards the barn, his heart beating like a hammer in his chest. He could feel his lungs fill with the chilling air, all the whilst ignoring his numbing feet that canned from the constant impact with the frozen dirt path. He was closing in on the large red barn when he heard the scream of his little cousin, closely followed by the sound of a soft body hitting the floorboard ground. He almost fell on the spot. No! No more of them! No more than 10 yards from the doorway. He went cold. His heart sank like a stone in a deep well. All expression drained, leaving only despair in his eyes. I failed! I was too late and I failed! Glistening droplets were forming in his eyes as he gently took step after step after step. He was at the barn. The door was only partly open and Marco was now standing directly behind it, the large red door, gently swaying in the wind. It was now the only thing standing between him and the horror that was waiting inside. He took a deep breath. Grasping his dagger tight, took a step back and swung open the large red door and toppled over a stool, dried herbs swaying. He took a step further in the soft girl's voice struggling. A blonde, 14-year-old girl came stumbling from the darkness of the barn. Her hands were rubbing her tummy as she revealed in her triumph, "That wasn't funny. I heard you scream." She giggled less as she read the expression on his face. "I did fall off that stool. My back," she moaned. Marco's face flooded with colour once more. "Oh, Cecilia, I thought something terrible had happened." Cecilia looked up at him with an odd expression. "What do you mean, silly? I slipped. Help me, Marco. I can't reach the herbs." "I don't need any herbs, silly." He helped her to her feet, and in one swift motion, the two embraced each other. She spoke with an ounce of pain. "So, are you okay?" "I am, silly. You shouldn't have come out here alone. It's not safe." She still had that odd expression of confusion, and a slight panic began to drift into her eyes. "Why, Marco? What's happened? Why are you acting so strange?" She retracted her hand from his back when she felt the cold metallic handling sticking from his fist. "Come on, we need to get you out of this place. It's really not safe." "What? Come on! We can't stay here." Remus was standing in front of the fireplace. His hands were trembling. He had Gladius in his grasp, but the blade felt heavy, much heavier than he expected. Crash! The sound of the roof being smashed through by something huge was quickly followed by heavy footsteps, and the sound of screaming was quickly silenced by a deep, vibrating growl that made Remus's chest hum. He realised then that it wasn't the blade that was heavy, it was his arm that was weak with fear. His body trembling with fear, trembling with every fibre as he watched the drops of blood fall to his feet. Blood that was now seeping from the floorboards above his head. The floorboards of his parents' bedroom. He turned towards the door, but he froze on the spot as the loudest, spine-breaking howl that had made the entire house tremble. Remus sobbed with terror. His trousers became wet as he pissed himself. The only thing that snapped him back to reality was the thought that his cousin and his little sister were returning, and they had no idea that there was a monster eating their parents. Remus did the only thing that he could do at the time. He stumbled out of the half-open door and began screaming. He could see Marco and Cecilia leaving the large red barn. "Turn back! Turn back! Run!" He was practically begging them. They spotted him and stopped, but he realised it wasn't him they were staring at. They began to shout, and he was almost 30 feet from the house when he began to make out a few words. "Run! Just fucking run!" He stumbled down the pathway, turning back. He cried in absolute horror as a pair of huge, glowing yellow eyes were watching him from the rooftop. "Run, you idiot! Move your ass and you fool!" The werewolf watched Remus as he tripped and staggered, slipped and finally began to pick up into a desperate dash down the gritty, icy hard dirt path. The wolf pulled a crooked smile, as if the sight of a terrified 15-year-old boy covered in his own piss and struggling to run gave it the greatest satisfaction. A nightmarish howl, followed by the thump as the creature leaped from the rooftop and landed on the frozen path. Remus was just over halfway from the barn. Marco turned to his little cousin. "We have to get in to barricade the barn door. When Remus gets inside, we won't be able to get back in the house." They both turned and ran. Remus was closing in, his hand still grasping the sword, but no matter how vigorously he ran, the deep, raspy exhale from the wolf was getting even closer and closer. Cecilia and Marco made it back to the large red door of the barn. She held it open while Marcos frantically searched for something to bar the door. He found it. A large timber beam, almost 10 yards in length, was propped in the corner behind a pile of discarded, swept-up straw and an old, rusted pitchfork with a crooked prong. "Yes!" As he gripped it, the weight astonished him. He thought to himself, "If that can't hold the door, I don't know what will." He wrestled the wooden beam from its resting place. "Right, you hold open the door. As soon as Remus gets inside, you pull it shut. Hey! Hey! Did you hear me? Sally?" His eyes shot to the doorway. His cousin was screaming at Remus. "Run! Run, Remus! Run, it's gaining on you!" Remus was only 10 yards from the barn. His cousin's cries fell silent upon him, as all he could make out was the maw of the werewolf open, the slick of saliva, and the stench of his parents' blood clung in its hot breath bellowing from the wolf's lungs. In those few moments, Remus cut himself off from the world. All his mind could see was the ghastly visage, flickering images of his sister being torn to pieces, his cousin ramming a pitchfork into the beast, only to have his guts wrenched out with a swift upward strike. He wanted to get up and fight, but he couldn't. His body was... it was gone. Only his spine was attached, a few strips of flesh draped along the floor. In that instant, Remus knew he wouldn't allow that to happen. He was too far, and the wolf was right behind him. He knew what he had to do. He spun the gladius in his hand, preparing to strike, but he didn't. He slipped, stumbled backwards, fell and tumbled. The wolf leaped, claws sprayed, jaw agape. Remus, only 15 feet from the large red doors, closed his eyes, and then nothing. The wolf didn't land on him. It didn't mangle his body. Instead, an old pitchfork with a crooked prong hurtled above his head. It struck its mark, and that mark was the werewolf's mouth. The prongs, almost rusted, were sharp enough to cut the soft flesh of the werewolf's throat. The creature howled, spun out of its intended trajectory, and slid into the edge of the path, whining, but not dead. Remus took his chance to scramble inside the barn. "That was one hell of a throw, Marco," screamed Cecilia, heaving the huge red wooden door shut. Remus panting. Miraculously, his hand was still clamped around the gladius. "Remus!" cried Marco. "Help me with the beam!" The two boys heaved and strained to lift the wooden bar into place, and just in time as the entire front side of the barn shook with a force that caused dust to trickle from the beams of hay to fall from the place that the three didn't think was possible for the hay to fall from. The werewolf slammed against the huge red wooden door. Sparks of wood were flying in every direction as the wolf struck the doors over and over again. But these doors were not those of simple farm cottage. They didn't budge. Razor-like claws of the werewolf dug in. Eventually, one of the planks of the redwood doors gave way, and a hideous hand that had quickly retract, leaving a huge-sized hole in the barn to which the moonlight burst through. Cecilia screamed in desperate panic. "It's getting through! Oh Jesus! It's breaking down the door!" The wolf stopped its assault, growled hideously. The sound it made was full of rage. And then a large black mass with a huge yellow eye engulfed the opening of the door. It stared at the two huddled in the dark, musty barn. Cecilia, who was whimpering, pulled herself close to Remus and pressed the side of her face against his chest. She screamed. A huge disfigured arm covered in thick, wiry black fur flew through the door hole. Its long, misshapen fingers, adorned with huge black talons like claws, were wriggling and writhing in the open spaces as if tentacles that were trying to snatch at the terrified blonde girl. As if from nowhere, Marco came dashing from the shadows and sliced at the wailing arm with an experienced but nonetheless accurate and somewhat effective slice with the gladius. The beast had a hollow cry, and this time he had severed several digits from the beast's hand. The arm drew back in retreat, which was quickly followed by a venomous grumble as a harsh smack against the large barn doors. The digits that had hit the dusty floor of the barn were clearly visible. View, a stream of moonlight poured through the arm-sized hole. The three looked on attentively as they began to twitch, then more violently as they began to turn, shrinking into the digits that resembled those of a woman. The three stared at the severed fingers with astonishment, but this was not for long, as an ear-splitting screech came from Cecilia. Ah! The moonlight was suddenly blocked by a huge dark figure. Two huge yellow orbs stared at them from the frost-bitten night. The drooling gape turned into a sinister grin. The wolf raised its hand. and, to the disbelief of the trio, the hand had 5 fingers. The beast stared at them with malice and vile intent. Only, it wasn't the 3 that the wolf was watching. It was Marco. He fell to his knees, dropping the sword and grasping at his temples with agony. A wretched, deep gargle of a voice echoed through his mind.
You have smelt before. You, whom I have so longingly wished to have devoured. You, who have evaded my reach till now.
The werewolf began to circle the barn, growling and hissing as it did so. Marco was still on his knees, but barely. He began to scream out in pain and anger. His nails had now begun to dig into the skin. The beast continued.
You, who bears the sign, the one who had foreseen my coming, I shall bring you death. I shall rip you apart, tear you. I shall free your muscles, clench, and your bones splinter. Before this, I will force you to watch as I feed on them.
No! He cried. Never! I will kill you! You won't touch them, you bastard! The beast roared with utter intimidation and rage.
You shall watch! You shall watch as you did before!
Never! Marco slammed at his fist into the hard ground of the hay barn. A cloud of dust rose in the air, and small fragments of grit from the impact showered down. Marco felt strange, as if sparks of electricity were pinging between his fingers. He looked down to check, but alas, there was nothing. All went silent for a few moments. Marco's shoulder began to burn with a searing light. By the gods, Marco! What the hell was that about? Stammered Remus, plucking straw and grit from his hair. It was nothing. You stay here. Keep Sally safe. No, proclaimed the little girl. You can't go out there alone. There are beasts out there. You saw what it did to the door. It will kill you. God damn it! Marco didn't react. He went to the barn door, stopped, and listened attentively. The wolf was nowhere to be heard. He twisted his shoulders and looked back at the two. You make sure to bar the doors behind me. Don't come out unless I call you. If I don't, then stay here till morning. Take 2 horses and ride south. You'll find a village called Oak Hill. Marco, whimpered Cecilia. Please do as I ask. It wants me, not you. I have to end this. If I don't, it will kill us all. He turned back and took the last few paces to the barn doors. The wooden beam that had been taken off before yielded with a single arm. The barn door gaped ajar. Marco stepped into the bitter cold gaze of the full moon, his fingers adjusting to his grip of the gladius. He took 15 quiet paces and stopped. His head twisted back one final time, indicating for the two to bar the door once more. As Remus pulled the door shut, the moonlight shone upon his face through the breached door. The light suddenly flashed, and a deep, reverberating growling and the smell of putrefying blood. The sound of a sword blade slicing through the frost-laden breeze of the autumn air. Marcos's face had a hard and expressionless look to it. The wolf stood between him and the large red doors of the barn. Its piercing gaze was fixed on him as it lowered its body, as it was ready to pounce. Marco was steady, his fingers flickered with static. His body turned to face the creature sideways. With a flick, the gladius was raised and Marco assumed a fighting position. The beast gave it a wicked smile, as if like a flash of a shadow. It lunged forward, claws extended towards Marco. As if a natural reaction, he dived aside, rolled and into a crouched position. He twisted and resumed his defensive stance, but the wolf was already a mid-leap. He reacted as best he could, rolling forward with the gladius in both hands. He slipped underneath the Saurian beast and cut its chest with the tip of the blade. He then arose, this time much faster, and began to sprint towards the barn. The beast was only 5 paces behind. He reached the door and leaped. 1, 2 steps, he ran up to the shredded door and span and swung with all his might. The creature howled as the blade was met with the resistance of the werewolf's muzzle. Marco landed behind the beast, but was in shock as the wolf was seemingly unscathed. Marco remembered his silver dagger. He threw the gladius at the towering monstrosity. His aim wasn't perfect. Marco wasn't bothered. He sprinted towards the monster, his dagger drawn, but the beast was fast. Too fast. It slipped past the hurtling sword and headbutted the 16-year-old with a spine-breaking hit. Marco fell, and the beast fell upon him. He desperately thrust the dagger, but the wolf pinned his arm with one of its malformed hands. Saliva dripped on his face as the hot stamp from the monster's breath bellowed out across his face. Marco almost gagged under the stench, but then instead of tearing him in pieces, as he was sure it would happen, the voice in his head began once more.
You fool! I shall now satisfy my hunger, my desire.
As from nowhere, a pitchfork speared the wolf on the end of the handle. Cecilia! In a split second, Marco's free hand snatched at his pocket, pulling a silver brooch pin, and with a fast, violent thrust, he stabbed the beast in the chest. The monster lifted and squealed. It swiped the leg of the dainty girl with its claw. She screamed and let go of the fork. Remus, with the gladius in his hand, swung the blade with utter fury. The clawed hand went soaring into the air, and Marco, with his dagger in the arm now free, thrusted the dagger, the silver stake entering through the bottom of his wolf's jaw. It bellowed with agony. The remaining clawed hand desperately tried to remove the silver that was melting its flesh. Marco gave one last scream of defiance, and with electric surging in his fist, he struck the handle of the dagger, forcing the tip to burst through the werewolf's cranial with a spurt of steaming blood. The wolf went quiet and slumped to one side, its hair falling off as it began to spasm and shrank into a small, feral-looking woman. Marco! The girl fell to her knees. Her hand was pressing against the finger-length sword on her thigh. I'm fine. Let's look at that leg. It's not deep. You'll be okay. Remus, give me a hand with this. Remus took a knee beside him, tore his sleeve and dressed her leg. He looked across at his older cousin. So, that thing, 6 years ago. Yes, it was that thing that killed them. And what now? Remus's eyes didn't swell, as Marco expected. He simply waited for a response. Let's get her inside. When dawn breaks, I'll pack what I need. Clothes, food, valuables. I can't stay, Remus. I need to go. Go where? What will you do? Go back home? I don't know. But I know now what I need to do. You and Cecilia go to the miller and his wife. They will help you. I'm going to take one of the horses. Where will you go? They both asked in unison. To Rogovan, maybe further. I'm going to join a guild. Wow, hope you guys enjoyed this series as much as I. Again, cannot thank you enough, Binx, for being so kind to choose myself to tell this long-standing family story of yours that I know it's been handed down from generation to generation. Thought you've done a fantastic job of rewriting it and getting it over to me so fast, and I do thank you for that, and I'm sure everybody else does. Keeping the consistency with your writing is really appreciated, buddy. And again, really enjoyed the series. Hope to see more in the future, whether it be from this series or any new projects as well. Guys and girls, please do let us know down below what your thoughts in the comments. As ever, please do like and share. If you haven't subscribed to DMT, now is a fantastic time to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to stay up to date with all DMT content. Remember, guys, if you're out in the deep, dark forests, keep your eyes on your surroundings and your ears open, because you don't know what's lurking in those shadows or the trees. And above all, remember, be safe, not sorry.